They chose me because I asked no questions, only how soon I could leave. The briefing room aboard the Undaunted Verdict smelled of oil and old incense, the kind that clings to metal and never fully burns away, settling into the seams of bulkheads and the joints of machinery until the entire ship breathes it with every cycle of the ventilation system. The Commissar stood at the head of the strategium table, hands clasped behind his back in a posture I had seen 1,000 times, official, distant, the stance of a man delivering orders that were not his own but which he would enforce with absolute conviction. His face was a mask of administrative detachment, carved from pale flesh and hard duty, and he did not look at me when he spoke. He looked at the data slate in his gloved hand, scrolling through lines of text I would never be permitted to read, information classified above my station and irrelevant to my function. The other officers flanked him like statues in dress uniforms, their shoulders adorned with medals and purity seals, their eyes fixed on points in the middle distance as though I were not standing 3 meters away at rigid attention. I stood with my boots together, spine straight, las rifle slung across my back, feeling the weight of my flak armor settle into my shoulders the way it had for 11 years of service across 4 campaigns and too many battlefields to name. "The Lighthouse Protocol," the Commissar said, his voice flat and factual, as though he were reading a supply manifest or a casualty report, something routine and unremarkable. "Ocean World Designation Tethys 7. Navigational beacon, dark for 6 standard months. Fleet inbound estimated time of arrival 72 hours. Without the beacon, warp storm interference will drag them into the gravity well. Total loss projected at 80,000 souls, 12 capital ships, void superiority in the subsector." He paused, and the data slate screen flickered in the low amber light that illuminated the strategium. I watched his eyes move across the text, absorbing information I would never see, processing calculations I would never understand. "Your mission is reactivation, manual activation, on-site, solo deployment." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. The officers waited, and I realized they were waiting for questions, for hesitation, for the inevitable moment when a guardsman asked why or how or what happened to the others. But I did not ask. I had learned long ago that questions were a luxury, and luxuries were for officers and nobles, and people who believed their opinions mattered in the grand mechanism of the Imperium. I was none of those things. I was a tool, sharpened by training and honed by survival, and tools do not question the hand that wields them. The silence in the room grew heavy, oppressive, and I saw something flicker across the Commissar's face, not surprise, but a kind of weary recognition, as though he had been hoping I would ask, and was disappointed that I had confirmed his expectations instead. His eyes finally lifted from the slate and met mine for a single cold second, and I saw something there I could not name, not pity, not regret, something older and more worn, something that lived in the space between duty and despair. He nodded once, a sharp downward jerk of his chin. "Departure at 0600. Submersible transport. The Emperor protects. Guardsman." The slate snapped off with a soft electronic chime. The officers turned in unison, a synchronized movement that would have been beautiful if it were not so mechanical, and filed out through the armored door in perfect silence. Their boots struck the steel decking with rhythmic precision, the sound of an empire that never stopped moving, never stopped grinding forward, consuming worlds and lives and souls in its endless hunger for survival. I remained at attention until the door sealed shut with a pneumatic hiss, alone in the briefing room with the taste of incense on my tongue and the hum of the ship's plasma reactors vibrating through the deck plates beneath my feet. I did not ask why the beacon had gone dark. I did not ask what happened to the previous teams because I had not been told there were previous teams, and ignorance is a kind of armor, thin and brittle but better than nothing. I did not ask why a single guardsman would be sent where others had presumably failed, or why the mission brief was 3 sentences long when orbital bombardment plans filled entire data vaults with tactical projections and contingency protocols. I asked only when I could leave, and the Commissar had given me a time. That was enough. That had always been enough. In 11 years of service, I had learned that the Imperium did not reward curiosity, it rewarded obedience, and obedience was the only currency I possessed in abundance. My bunk in the lower troop decks smelled like sweat and boot polish, and the particular staleness that comes from recycled air breathed by 10,000 men packed into a ship designed for 8. I sat on the edge of the thin mattress, feeling the metal frame creak beneath my weight, and checked my kit for the 4th time that night. Lazarifal cleaned and blessed with the proper oils, the litany of maintenance whispered over each component as I disassembled and reassembled the weapon with the automatic precision of ritual. 3 charge packs, each one tested and confirmed at full capacity, their weight familiar and reassuring, clipped to my webbing. Combat knife with an edge I had sharpened to a hair-splitting keenness, the blade inscribed with a prayer I could no longer read because the words had been worn away by years of use. Rebreather with fresh filters, the mask's rubber seal soft and pliable against my palm. Flare pistol loaded with a single red phosphorus shell, more for signaling than combat, though I had seen men use them as weapons when desperation demanded it. Ration bars wrapped in wax paper, each one stamped with a production date and a purity seal, tasteless but nutritious. Water canister filled to capacity, the liquid sloshing softly when I shook it. Microvox unit clipped to my chest webbing, its indicator light glowing a steady green to confirm functionality. Emperor's prayer inscribed on a strip of parchment, folded into my breast pocket. The ink faded, but the words still legible, still potent. My hands moved through the inspection with the rhythm of ritual, each item touched and confirmed, each strap tightened to the correct tension, each piece of equipment positioned exactly where it needed to be for immediate access in darkness or under fire. Around me, the deck was dim and quiet. Most of the regiment deployed planetside on some operation I had not been briefed on, or standing watch rotation in the gun decks and observation blisters that studded the ship's hull like iron warts. I was alone, and I preferred it that way. Solitude felt like preparation, like the silence before a Lazarifal's discharge, the moment when the world holds its breath and waits for violence or salvation. I did not sleep. I sat on the bunk and checked my equipment again and again, until the chronometer on the wall clicked over to 0500 and it was time to move. I had been in the Astra Militarum for 11 years, 3 months, and 16 days. I had survived the meat grinder of Vorash IV, where we lost 2/3 of our company to Orc artillery in a single afternoon. The sky black with smoke and the ground slick with blood and oil, the greenskins howling as they charged through the gaps in our line, and we held because there was nowhere to retreat to. I had held the line at Ges Secundus when the heretic militia came screaming out of the Factorum ruins with autoguns and rust-eaten blades and faith in false gods, and we stacked their bodies so high the commissar used the pile as a firing platform to direct our counterattack. I had earned a marksman's citation after putting a last round through an Orc warboss's eye at 300 meters, the shot taken in a moment of perfect clarity when the wind died and my breath stilled and the Emperor guided my hand. I had received a commendation for valor under fire when I dragged a wounded sergeant out of a kill zone while lasfire cooked the air around us and shrapnel rang off my helmet like hail. I had a scar across my ribs from a greenskin chopper that came close enough to taste my blood, close enough that I felt the heat of the blade and smelled the stink of the creature's breath before I put my combat knife through its throat. I had never asked for reassignment, never requested leave, never filed a grievance, or sought medical discharge despite injuries that would have qualified me for honorable retirement. I did what I was told. I went where I was sent. The Emperor's will and the sergeant's orders were indistinguishable, 2 voices speaking the same truth, and I had made peace with that a long time ago. The Imperium did not need philosophers or poets, it needed soldiers who could follow orders and pull triggers and die when dying was required. I was good at all 3. So when the commissar told me to go to a storm-racked island in the middle of a black ocean and turn on a light, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt chosen. Not expendable, not random, not simply the next name on a roster. Chosen. The mission was simple, surgical, important. The fleet depended on it. 80,000 souls depended on it. I imagined the navigators aboard those ships, their third eyes blind in the warp storm, reaching for a signal that was not there, clawing at the darkness with psychic senses that found only howling chaos. I imagined the armsmen and the officers and the troopers packed into the troop ships, praying for safe passage, trusting that the light would guide them home. And I imagined my hands on the activation lever, the moment the beacon flared to life, the moment I saved them all. It felt clean, it felt right, it felt like purpose. I did not think about why they sent 1 man instead of a squad. I did not think about the silence that had followed the commissar's words, the way the officers had avoided looking at me, the way the briefing had felt less like orders and more like a funeral rite. I thought about the light, and I thought about duty, and I told myself that this was my chance to matter, to be remembered, to carve my name into the Imperium's endless ledger of service and sacrifice. I slept for 3 hours without dreams and woke feeling focused and calm. The submersible was older than the war, maybe older than the subsector charter that had brought the Imperium to Tethys Vive in the first place. Its hull was pitted with age and patched with weld scars that formed abstract patterns across the dark metal, evidence of decades of repairs and refits and desperate maintenance. The interior was a cramped tube of riveted steel and humming cogitator banks, barely wide enough for 2 men to stand abreast, the walls studded with pipes and cables that dripped condensation and smelled of oil and brine. The pilot was a servitor, its face a mask of surgical steel and fiber optic cables, its eyes replaced with green-lit optics that tracked nothing and everything in mechanical sweeps. It did not speak, it did not acknowledge me. Its hands were fused to the control columns, melted flesh and corroded metal forming a permanent interface, and I wondered briefly if it had volunteered for the conversion or if that choice had been made for it by the Mechanicus adepts who maintained the ship's machine spirits. I strapped into the passenger cradle, feeling the restraints lock across my chest and thighs with pneumatic hisses, and watched through the small reinforced viewport as the undaunted verdict receded into the black above. The ship's hull was illuminated by running lights and the glow of plasma drives, a floating cathedral of iron and faith suspended in the void, and then the ocean swallowed us, and the world became pressure and darkness. The descent was smooth at first, the submersible dropping through layers of water that shifted from black to blacker, the hull creaking softly as the pressure increased, the temperature inside the cabin dropping until I could see my breath misting in the amber light of the control panels. The descent took 11 hours. I spent them in silence, listening to the creak of the hull and the rhythmic thud of the engines, a sound like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. I checked my weapons again, running my hands over the Lazrafal's stock and barrel, tracing the inscriptions and purity seals, whispering the Emperor's prayer until the words lost their meaning and became pure sound, a mantra to fill the void. The servitor never moved except to adjust course, its hands twitching on the controls, its breath a mechanical rasp that never changed tempo, never faltered. I wondered if it had been human once, if it remembered the sky, if some fragment of its soul still dreamed inside the prison of its augmetics. Then I stopped wondering, because wondering is a kind of doubt, and doubt is the first step toward failure. The storm hit us 3 kilometers from the island. The submersible shuddered and yawed violently, alarms shrieking in high-pitched electronic wails, and I saw the servitor's hands tighten on the control columns as the water outside churned into white chaos. Rain hammered the viewport like autocannon fire, a sound so loud I thought the glass would shatter. Lightning split the dark in jagged white seams, illuminating waves the size of hive blocks, mountains of water rising and collapsing with the weight of planetary geology. For a moment I thought we would capsize, thought the ocean would fold us into its cold belly and the mission would end before it began. My body crushed by pressure or drowned in salt water, another nameless casualty in the Imperium's endless war. But the servitor corrected, adjusted, its fused hands dancing across the controls with inhuman precision, and the submersible broke the surface into a screaming wind that shook the entire frame like a child's toy. Through the viewport I saw the island, a black knuckle of rock rising out of the storm, sharp and hostile, its cliffs sheer and slick with spray. And atop it, impossibly tall and impossibly slender, the lighthouse. It was larger than I had imagined. The images in the mission brief had been grainy, low resolution, taken from orbit by auger arrays that struggled to penetrate the storm's interference. This was different. The structure was easily 100 meters tall, built from some dark stone that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it, its surface covered in carvings. I could not read from this distance Gothic script and imperial iconography, prayers and warnings etched deep into the rock. The beacon housing at the summit was a dome of crystalline panels, dark now, lifeless, but even unlit it radiated a weight I could feel in my chest, a pressure that had nothing to do with the storm. The servitor guided us toward a dock jutting out from the island's eastern edge, a structure of corroded metal and barnacle-encrusted pylons that should not have held together in this storm but somehow did, swaying and groaning but refusing to collapse. The submersible's clamps locked onto the mooring rail with a metallic scream, and the hatch cycled open with a hiss of equalized pressure, and the storm poured in. Rain lashed my face, cold enough to numb my skin in seconds, each drop striking like a needle. Wind howled around the submersible's hull, a sound like voices, like the planet itself screaming its displeasure at my presence. I unstrapped and climbed out into the maelstrom. The wind hit me like a physical blow, staggering me, and I grabbed the mooring rail to keep from being thrown into the black water below. I secured my rebreather even though the air was breathable, checked the Vox unit even though I knew it would find no signal in this interference, and stepped onto the dock. The surface was slick with rain and sea spray, treacherous, each step a calculated risk. I turned back to signal the servitor, but the hatch was already sealing, and the submersible was sinking back beneath the black water, disappearing into the depths without hesitation or farewell, its mission completed. I was alone. The dock led to a stone pathway carved into the island's rock face, narrow and steep, slick with rain and algae. I moved carefully, one boot in front of the other, Lazrafal unslung now and held at low ready even though there was nothing to shoot at, nothing but stone and water and wind. The pathway climbed, switchbacking up the cliff face, and I climbed with it, muscles burning, breath coming hard, rain blinding me. Lightning flashed again, and in the brief illumination I saw something that made me pause. Rope coils stacked neatly beside the pathway, secured under a tarp that was tied down with military precision. Fresh rope, no rust, no rot. The fibers were clean, still supple, as though they had been placed here recently. I stared at them for 3 full seconds, my mind trying to reconcile the presence of maintained equipment on an island that had been silent for 6 months, that had supposedly been abandoned, that should have been empty. Then the lightning faded, and the dark returned, and I continued walking because standing still in a storm is how you die. The lighthouse entrance was a heavy steel door set into the base of the structure, marked with the Imperial Aquila in flaking gold paint. I expected it to be locked, rusted shut, resistant. I expected to need the breaching charge in my pack, the plasteel explosive I had been issued for emergencies. Instead, when I turned the handle, it opened smoothly, almost eagerly, the hinges well-oiled and silent, as though it had been waiting. Warm air spilled out into the storm, carrying the scent of oil and something else, something organic and faint that I could not identify, something that smelled like habitation, like recent human presence. I stepped inside and pushed the door shut behind me, leaning my weight against it until the latch caught, and the storm's roar became muffled, distant, a background hum instead of a deafening assault. I stood in the sudden quiet, dripping water onto stone, and looked around. The interior was a spiral, a single vast shaft that rose into darkness, the walls carved from the same dark stone as the exterior. Gothic inscriptions covered every surface, prayers to the god emperor in High Gothic and Low Gothic, and languages I did not recognize, litanies of protection and guidance and supplication. Let the faithful shine eternal. Let the lost be found. Let the emperor's light never falter. The words repeated, spiraling upward, disappearing into shadow. Loom strips ran along the walls at chest height, glowing a pale green that illuminated without comforting, casting long shadows that moved with my breath. The air was warmer than it should have been, as though the structure retained heat from some internal source, some hidden furnace or geothermal vent. I checked the Vox unit, keying the transmit function and listening to the static hiss that confirmed what I already knew: no signal, which was expected given the storm interference and the thick stone walls. I would have to complete the mission and reactivate the beacon before I could report success, before I could confirm that the light was burning and the fleet was safe. The thought steadied me, gave me purpose. I slung the Lazrafal across my back and began to climb the spiral staircase that wound upward into the heart of the lighthouse. Each step worn smooth by centuries of use, each footfall echoing in the shaft like a heartbeat. The staircase wound upward in a tight spiral, each step worn smooth by centuries of use, the stone polished to a dull sheen by the passage of countless boots. My own footfalls echoed in the shaft, a rhythmic thud, thud, thud that became hypnotic, meditative, a sound that filled my head and drove out thought. I counted the steps out of habit, a reflex from training exercises where we climbed hive stairwells under full pack, and the sergeants screamed at us to maintain cadence: 50, 100, 200, 300. When I reached 500, I stopped counting because the numbers stopped mattering, because the climb had become its own reality, endless and unchanging. And I focused instead on breathing, on the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation, on the burn in my thighs and calves that meant my body was working. that I was still alive and functional. The loom strips provided just enough light to see the next 10 steps, no more, creating a bubble of visibility that moved with me as I climbed. Beyond that bubble was darkness, above and below, a void that seemed to press against my awareness like physical weight. The inscriptions on the walls continued without pause, prayers and litanies flowing past in an endless stream of Gothic script, and I found myself reading them as I climbed, my lips moving silently to form the words, "The Emperor protects those who serve. The faithful shall not falter. In his light we find our path." Simple truths, dogma repeated so often it had worn grooves into my mind deeper than any stairwell. I believed them because I had never been given reason not to, because belief was easier than doubt and more useful in a firefight. The first landing appeared after what felt like an hour but was probably less, time having become slippery and unreliable in the enclosed spiral. A doorway opened into a small chamber, and I paused at the threshold, sweeping the room with my lasrifle even though it was clearly empty, even though the instinct was paranoid and unnecessary. Living quarters. Bunks lined the walls, 6 of them, each with a thin mattress covered by a folded blanket, the folds crisp and military precise. A table stood in the center of the room, its surface scarred by years of use but clean, covered with tin plates and cups arranged as though someone had just finished a meal. A small stove sat in the corner, its surface cold but functional, a pot resting on the burner with its lid slightly askew. The air smelled of old smoke and something else, something like sweat and lived-in spaces, the particular scent of human habitation. I stepped inside, lowering the lasrifle but keeping it ready, my eyes scanning for threats that logic told me did not exist. The bunks were made with military precision, blankets tucked and corners sharp enough to satisfy the most demanding drill instructor. On the table, someone had left a half-eaten ration bar beside a tin cup still containing a few milliliters of water. I approached slowly, reached out, touched the cup. It was not dusty. I lifted it and sniffed plain water, no contamination, no algae, no bacterial film. Fresh, or at least fresh enough that it had not yet begun to spoil. My heart began to beat faster, a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with wrongness, with the fundamental disconnect between what should be and what was. This room should have been abandoned. This room should have been covered in dust and rot and the evidence of months of neglect. Instead, it looked as though the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment, as though they might return at any second and resume whatever routine they had been following. I set the cup down carefully, as though disturbing it might trigger some unseen mechanism, and moved to the far wall where a row of boots stood in perfect alignment. I counted them. 43 pairs. Standard issue guard boots, sizes varying from small to large, some worn more than others, the leather cracked and stained but still serviceable. 43 men. The number meant nothing to me initially, just a data point, a piece of information. But as I stared at those boots, lined up like soldiers on parade, I felt something cold begin to coil in my gut. 43. Not one team, not two. Multiple deployments, multiple missions, all ending here, all leaving their boots behind. Why? Guardsmen did not abandon equipment. We lived and died by our gear. Leaving your boots behind was like leaving your rifle or your faith unthinkable. I turned away from the boots and found the data slates stacked on a shelf beside the stove, each one labeled with a date and a name written in permanent marker. I picked up the first one and activated it, the screen flickering to life with a soft chime. The battery was still charged. Another impossibility in a chain of impossibilities. The display showed a log entry in standard guard format, the text clean and professional. Day 1. Arrival. Storm severe but manageable. Lighthouse structure intact. No hostile contacts. Proceeding to beacon chamber. All equipment functional. The Emperor protects. Guardsman Val, 88th Cadian, service number 4472 Alpha. I scrolled to the next entry, my thumb moving across the slate's interface with practiced ease. Day 2. Beacon systems reviewed. Mechanicus instructions partially intact. Manual activation required. All personnel accounted for. Morale high. Weather worsening but shelter adequate. Guardsman Val. And the next. Day 3. Beacon operational. Mission accomplished. Fleet will be saved. For the Emperor. For the Imperium. It is my honor. Guardsman Val. That was the last entry. The date was 6 months ago. I checked the other slates, pulling them from the shelf one by one, reading through logs that spanned not days but years. Different names, different regiments: Cadian, Katachan, Mordian, Talan, even a Vostroyan and 2 Krieg guardsmen whose entries were terse to the point of mechanical. All ending the same way. Beacon operational. Mission accomplished. No distress calls. No requests for extraction. No records of departure. They had activated the beacon, completed their missions, and then the logs simply stopped, as though the act of success had erased them from existence. I stood in the quiet chamber, listening to the storm moan against the stone walls, a sound that was muffled but persistent, and I felt the first real thread of unease wind through my chest and settle like ice water in my stomach. If they had activated the beacon, why was it dark now? If the missions were accomplished, why had they stayed? Where had they gone? I thought about the rope on the dock, the fresh water in the cup, the boots lined up like soldiers waiting for inspection. I thought about 43 men, and I thought about the silence that had followed the commissar's words, and I began to understand that I had not been told the truth, or rather, I had been told a truth so carefully edited that it might as well have been a lie. I left the chamber, sealing the door behind me, and continued climbing. The staircase narrowed as it rose, the walls pressing closer, the air growing warmer and thicker. The loom strips flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows that looked like figures descending toward me before resolving into nothing tricks of light and exhausted perception, my mind filling the darkness with phantoms, because the mind abhors emptiness. I ignored them. I had seen worse things on battlefields, real horrors made of flesh and malice, and I would not allow myself to be frightened by shadows and silence. I climbed past 2 more landings, each containing similar living quarters, bunks, tables, supplies. Each room was eerily prepared, maintained, as though the occupants had left moments before my arrival. Ration packs opened and resealed with the correct military folds. Water pitchers filled to identical levels. Blankets folded with geometric precision. In one room I found a chair positioned facing the single small window, a narrow slit in the stone that looked out over the black ocean, and when I approached it, I saw that the seat was worn smooth, the wood polished by repeated use, as though someone had spent hours sitting there, watching, waiting. For what? For rescue that never came? For orders that were never transmitted? Or for something else, something I could not yet name? At the 4th landing I stopped and checked my chronometer, the device strapped to my wrist and synced to shipboard time. 4 hours since I had entered the lighthouse. The climb should not have taken this long. The structure was tall, yes, but not impossibly so, 100 meters at most, and I had climbed hive stairwells twice that height in half the time. I looked up the staircase. It continued into darkness, curving out of sight, showing no sign of ending. I looked down the same. Distance had become unreliable, elastic, as though the lighthouse existed in a space that did not quite obey normal geometry. I knew that was impossible, that my perception was simply distorted by exhaustion and the monotony of the spiral. But the knowledge did nothing to ease the disquiet that had settled over me like a wet cloak. I drank water from my canister, the liquid cold and metallic on my tongue, and ate half a ration bar, chewing the tasteless compressed nutrients mechanically while I rested against the stone wall. My legs ached, my shoulders burned from the weight of my pack and rifle, but I was far from my limits. I had marched for days with less rest and more weight, had fought through exhaustion that made this climb feel like a casual stroll. I was not weak. I was not afraid. I was simply beginning to understand that this mission was not what I had believed it to be, that the simplicity I had trusted was a lie wrapped around a truth too terrible to be spoken plainly. I continued climbing. The staircase began to change as I rose, the stone walls giving way to sections of metal and strange crystalline material that pulsed with faint inner light. Psychic reactive compounds, I realized, recognizing them from technical briefings I had sat through but never fully understood. The Mechanicus used such materials in their most sacred machinery, in devices that interfaced with the warp or required human consciousness to operate. Their presence here meant the lighthouse was not merely a structure of stone and steel, it was a machine, a device, something built with purpose beyond simple illumination. The temperature continued to rise. I unsealed my jacket, letting the cool air from below rise against my sweat-soaked undershirt. The loom strips glowed brighter here, their light taking on a greenish quality that reminded me of the bioluminescent fungi we had encountered on Warhammer 40K, growing in the corpse piles where the orcs had stacked their dead. I pushed the memory away, focused on the stairs, on the rhythm of climbing, on the simple mechanical act of placing one boot above the other and pushing upward. The beacon chamber door appeared without warning, as though it had simply materialized in front of me between one step and the next. One moment I was climbing, my mind empty and focused. The next I was standing on a wide landing before a massive set of double doors that rose 3 meters high and were inscribed with the Imperial Aquila, surrounded by flowing Gothic script that hurt to read, the letters seeming to shift and writhe when I looked at them directly. Let the faithful shine eternal. Let the lost be found. Let the Emperor's light never falter. The words were carved deep into the metal, inlaid with gold that had tarnished to a dull green, and beneath them were smaller inscriptions in languages I did not recognize, prayers or warnings or both. The doors were closed but not locked. I could see that from the way they sat in their frame, slightly ajar, a thin line of brighter light spilling through the gap. I placed my hand on the cold metal, feeling a faint vibration beneath my palm, a thrumming that might have been machinery or might have been something else, something alive. I pushed, and the doors swung open smoothly, silently, and I stepped into the beacon chamber. The space was vast beyond reason, a cathedral hollowed from the lighthouse's summit. The walls rose 50 meters to the crystalline dome overhead, which was composed of panels that caught the storm's lightning and refracted it into prismatic patterns that danced across every surface. The beacon apparatus dominated the center, a towering structure of brass and silver, and something that shimmered like glass but was not glass, intricate beyond comprehension, covered in etchings and symbols that crawled across its surface like living things. Psychic resonators, I realized, recognizing the design from the technical manuals I had studied. Warp conductive materials. The beacon did not project light in the conventional sense. It projected something through the warp, a signal that could pierce the Imperium itself and guide ships across the nightmare between stars. And surrounding the beacon, arranged in a perfect circle like supplicants before an altar, were the thrones. 43 thrones. Heavy steel frames bolted to the stone floor with massive rivets, each one equipped with restraints across the chest and thighs and wrists, each one trailing cables that connected to the beacon's base like umbilical cords. The thrones faced inward, toward the beacon, and each one had something mounted above its headrest, a crown of silver wire and dark metal, studded with small crystalline nodes that pulsed with the same greenish light as the loom strips. Most of the thrones were empty, their restraints hanging loose, their neural crowns suspended in waiting positions. But not all. 12 thrones were occupied. 12 bodies sat in rigid attention, their flesh desiccated and drawn tight over bone, their uniforms rotted into rags that barely clung to skeletal frames. Their hands were locked onto the armrests, fingers fused to the metal by some process I could not identify, corrosion or mutation or something worse. Their heads were tilted back, mouths open in silent screams or prayers, and their eyes were glowing. Faint green light pulsed in the empty sockets, rhythmic and steady, synchronized with the beacon's hum. They were still transmitting, still working, still serving. I stood frozen in the doorway, laser rifle raised on pure instinct, staring at the dead men who were not quite dead, and my breath came fast and shallow, panic clawing at the edges of my discipline. They had not left. They had never left. They were still here, still working. Their minds burned into the machinery, their bodies kept in some horrific state between life and death, sustained by the throne's mechanisms for purposes I could not yet comprehend, but was beginning to fear. I forced myself to breathe, to lower the rifle, to think. The bodies did not move. The beacon hummed. The storm raged beyond the crystalline dome, lightning flashing in brilliant white bursts that illuminated the chamber in stark relief. I walked slowly into the room, my boots echoing on stone, circling the ring of thrones, examining each one with the detached focus I had learned on battlefields, where looking too closely at the dead meant losing your mind. Guardsmen. All of them. I recognized unit insignias, even on the rotted cloth. Cadian, Catachan, Mordian, Talan. Others I could not place. Decades of service represented here, maybe longer. Some of the bodies were so old they were little more than skeletons held together by dried sinew. Others looked recent weeks, maybe months. Their flesh was grey and sunken but still recognizably human. their features preserved by whatever process the thrones employed. One man's face was still partially intact, his skin grey and papery, but his features clear enough to read the name stenciled on his flak armor, Val. The same name from the data slate. The Cadian who had written "mission accomplished." He had meant it. He had completed his mission, and this was his reward. I found the technical manuals stacked on a lectern beside the beacon's control console. Thick volumes bound in leather and stamped with the seal of the Adeptus Mechanicus, their pages filled with dense Gothic text and engineering schematics that hurt to look at for too long. I opened the first volume, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline or fear or both, and began to read. The language was formal, ritualistic, the kind of technical documentation that treated machinery as sacred and function as prayer. I had read similar texts during training, when we were taught to maintain our lasguns and recognize the machine spirits that inhabited our equipment. But this was different. This was not instruction, this was scripture. Theology wrapped around engineering. Faith made manifest in steel and psychic resonance. The beacon required a human interface. That much was clear within the first 3 pages. Not a servitor. Servitors lacked the necessary psychic resonance, their lobotomized minds too damaged to project consciousness through the warp. Not a remote system automation could not provide the living signal the beacon required, could not generate the psychic anchor that navigators used to pierce the storm's interference. A living human mind, willingly offered. Its consciousness expanded and projected through the warp to serve as a navigational marker. The technical term was psychic projection, but the manual used other words as well, offering sacrifice, eternal service. The subject remained alive, technically, sustained by the throne's life support systems, their body maintained in a state of minimal function while their consciousness was stretched across the immaterium like a thread of light in infinite darkness. I read about the neural crown, about how it interfaced directly with the brain's psychic centers, bypassing normal sensory processing to tap into the raw consciousness beneath. I read about the restraints, about how they were necessary not to imprison but to prevent involuntary movement during the projection process, to keep the subject stable while their mind traveled distances that had no physical meaning. I read about the life support systems, about the nutrient feeds and waste management and respiratory assistance that kept the body alive long after the mind had left it behind. And I read about the duration: weeks, months, sometimes years, depending on the subject's resilience and the beacon's requirements. Some subjects lasted decades, their bodies withering to nothing while their minds continued to transmit, continued to serve, continued to shine in the dark. The manual called it an honor. The manual said the Emperor himself blessed those who undertook this service, that their souls would be elevated in death, that they would be remembered in the annals of the Mechanicus as heroes who had given everything for the Imperium's survival. The manual did not mention that they would die alone, screaming silently into the warp, their consciousness torn and stretched and burned until nothing remained but the signal itself. The manual did not mention that this was the only way the beacon could function, that generations of Imperial engineering had failed to find an alternative, that the Imperium's survival depended on a steady supply of willing sacrifices who would sit in those thrones and burn. I closed the manual, my hands trembling now, and looked at the 12 glowing eyes. They had all read these words, they had all understood what was required, and they had chosen to sit down anyway, to secure the restraints with their own hands, to pull the neural crown onto their heads and activate the systems that would consume them. Why? Duty? Faith? The simple understanding that someone had to do it, and they were already here, and the fleet depended on them? I walked to the control console, a bank of screens and switches and brass levers that looked like they belonged in a cathedral more than a machine. The main display showed system diagnostics in crawling Gothic text, most of it incomprehensible technical jargon about psychic resonance frequencies and warp channel stability, but one line was perfectly clear, written in simple low Gothic that even a child could understand. Human interface required. Manual activation protocol engaged. Awaiting volunteer. I scrolled through the options, my fingers moving across the console's brass controls, searching for alternatives, for emergency protocols, for anything that did not require a living human being to die slowly in one of those thrones. There was nothing. The system had been designed with brutal efficiency, with no fail-safes and no alternatives, because alternatives would have been pointless. The beacon's function was absolute. It either worked or it did not, and it only worked if someone was willing to pay the price. I checked the Vox unit clipped to my chest, keying the transmit function even though I knew it was useless, even though the storm outside was too strong to allow any signal to penetrate. Static hissed in my ear, white noise that sounded almost like voices, almost like the whisper of the warp itself. I shut it off. Even if I could reach the fleet, even if I could somehow transmit through the storm's interference, what would I say? The beacon requires a sacrifice, and I am not willing to make it? Abort the mission? Condemn 80,000 souls to death in the warp because I was afraid of sitting in a chair and burning for the Emperor? I thought about the Commissar's face, about the way he had looked at me for that single cold second, about the weight I had seen in his eyes. He had known. They had all known. This was not a mission in the conventional sense, it was a selection, a culling, a way of identifying which guardsmen were expendable enough to send and obedient enough not to ask questions. I had volunteered by asking how soon I could leave. I had condemned myself with my own eagerness to serve. I walked to the nearest empty throne, my boots heavy on the stone floor, each step an effort of will. The throne was massive up close, easily 2 meters tall, its frame bolted to the floor with rivets the size of my fist. The restraints were thick leather reinforced with steel cables, worn smooth by previous use, stained with sweat and other fluids I did not want to identify. The neural crown hung above the headrest, a circlet of silver wire and dark metal studded with crystalline nodes that pulsed with faint light, as though they were already active, already waiting. I reached out and touched the armrest. The metal was cold, but not as cold as I expected. It felt almost warm, as though it retained heat from previous occupants, as though it remembered the bodies that had sat here and burned. I looked at the throne beside me, at the body of Guardsman Val, at his grey flesh, and his glowing eyes and his skeletal hands fused to the metal. I wondered if he could still feel. I wondered if some fragment of his consciousness remained trapped in that withered shell, aware but unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but transmit and transmit and transmit until his body finally gave up and he died. I wondered if death would be a release, or if the transmission would continue even then, his soul bound to the beacon forever, unable to move on to whatever judgment or oblivion awaited in the Emperor's embrace. I sat down. The throne accepted me, the backrest molding itself to my spine as though it had been waiting for me specifically. I placed my hands on the armrests, feeling the cold metal beneath my palms, feeling the slight vibration of the beacon's hum traveling up through the frame and into my bones. The restraints were within reach, thick leather straps with steel buckles, simple mechanisms that anyone could operate alone. I could put them on myself. I could secure my chest, my thighs, my wrists. I could reach up and pull the neural crown down onto my head. I could activate the systems with a single thought, with a single prayer, and the beacon would flare to life and the fleet would be saved and I would become the 44th light in the dark. But not yet. Not yet. I stood abruptly, the movement almost panicked, and walked away from the throne before I could talk myself into staying. There had to be another way. I was a soldier, trained to improvise, to adapt, to find solutions under pressure. I had survived situations that should have killed me by thinking clearly and acting decisively. I would not simply accept this. I would not sit down and burn without exhausting every other option first. I spent the next hour searching the chamber, examining every corner, every piece of equipment, every inscription on the walls. I found supply lockers filled with nutrient paste and water rations, enough to sustain someone for months if they were supplementing the throne's life support. I found maintenance tools, wrenches and screwdrivers and diagnostic probes that looked more ceremonial than functional. I found a small shrine built into the wall, an alcove carved from stone and decorated with candles burned down to wax puddles and purity seals that had yellowed with age. Someone had knelt here and prayed before sitting in the throne. Multiple someones, judging by the worn grooves in the stone floor. I found no weapons. I found no communications equipment beyond the console, which was hardwired into the beacon and could not be repurposed. I found no escape route, no hidden passages, no maintenance shafts that led anywhere except down the staircase I had already climbed. The chamber was sealed, self-contained, designed with a single purpose. This was not a way station or an observation post. This was an altar, and I was the offering. I returned to the control console and tried to access the system's deeper functions, tried to find command overrides or emergency protocols or anything that might allow me to delay or circumvent the manual activation requirement. The console resisted me, its interface locked behind layers of Mechanicus encryption and ritual passwords I did not know. I tried brute forcing it, cycling through standard Imperial command codes, through regiment-specific authentication phrases, through every prayer and litany I had memorized during training. Nothing worked. The system was designed to be operated by those who had already made the choice, who had already sat in the throne and given themselves to the beacon. There were no backdoors, no shortcuts, no ways to cheat the machine. I checked my chronometer. 24 hours since I had entered the lighthouse. 48 hours until the fleet arrived. I had time. I had time to think, to search, to find some solution that did not involve sitting in that throne and burning for the Emperor. I told myself this, even as I looked at the empty seat, even as I felt the beacon's hum in my chest, even as I saw the 12 glowing eyes watching me from their eternal prison. But deep in my chest, where truth lives beneath all the lies we tell ourselves, I knew. I had known from the moment I saw the thrones. I had known from the moment I read the manuals. I had known from the moment the commissar handed me the mission brief, and I asked no questions. This was always how it was going to end. The only variable was how long I would fight against the inevitable, how much time I would waste pretending there was another way. I sat on the floor beside the empty throne, my back against its cold frame, and closed my eyes. I prayed, not to the Emperor but to myself, trying to find some reserve of courage or acceptance or simple resignation that would allow me to do what needed to be done. The words came haltingly, broken fragments of litanies I had learned by rote but never truly understood. The Emperor protects. Did he? Or did he simply demand, endlessly, more sacrifice, more blood, more souls fed into the machinery of the Imperium's survival? The faithful shall not falter. But I was faltering. I was sitting on a stone floor, paralyzed by fear, unable to move forward or back, trapped between duty and survival. I thought about the fleet. I thought about 80,000 souls, most of them strangers I would never meet, people whose names I would never know, soldiers and crew and officers who were trusting that the light would guide them home. They were not asking me to die. They did not even know I existed, but they needed me to die anyway, needed me to sit in that throne and burn, because that was the only way the beacon would shine and they would survive. Was that fair? No. Did it matter? No. Fairness was a concept for philosophers and politicians, not for soldiers who lived and died at the whim of orders they did not understand. I thought about Guardsman Val, about his final log entry. Mission accomplished. It is my honor. He had meant it. He had understood what was required. And he had done it. And some part of him, some fragment of consciousness still trapped in that withered body, was probably still serving, still transmitting, still holding the line decades after most men would have broken. That was what it meant to be a soldier in the Astra Militarum. Not glory or heroism or recognition, just the quiet understanding that someone had to hold the line, and it might as well be you. And if you died doing it, then at least you died doing something that mattered. I opened my eyes and looked at the throne. It waited, patient and implacable, a machine that had consumed 43 men and would consume me as well if I gave it the chance. I should have been terrified. I should have been screaming, fighting, clawing at the doors in a desperate attempt to escape, but I felt only a strange calm, a quiet resignation that settled over me like a familiar coat. This was duty. This was service. This was what I had signed up for 11 years ago when I swore my oath and put on the uniform. I had just never expected it to feel so much like defeat. I stood. My legs were steady. My hands did not shake. I walked to the console and reviewed the activation sequence one final time, memorizing each step, each switch and lever and prayer. The process was simple, almost elegant in its brutality. Sit, restrain, activate, transmit, die slowly, screaming into the void, while the fleet followed your light home. Easy. Mechanical. Inevitable. I checked my chronometer. 36 hours until the fleet arrived. If I activated the beacon now, there would be time for the signal to stabilize, time for the psychic thread to extend fully through the warp and become reliable. The navigators would lock onto me hours before they reached the storm's edge, would track me through the chaos, would follow me like a guiding star. I would save them, all 80,000, and no one would ever know my name. I walked to the empty throne and sat down. The metal was warmer than before, or perhaps I was simply more aware of every sensation, every detail heightened by the knowledge of what I was about to do. I placed my hands on the armrests and felt the slight vibration of the beacon's machinery traveling through the frame, a pulse that matched my heartbeat or perhaps influenced it, synchronizing my body with the device I was about to become part of. The restraints hung loose beside me, leather straps darkened by sweat and wear, buckles tarnished but functional. I stared at them for a long moment, my breath coming steady and controlled, my mind surprisingly clear. This was the moment. This was the choice. Once I secured these restraints, once I activated the neural crown, there would be no going back. I would become part of the beacon, my consciousness burned into its machinery, my body sustained in a state between life and death, while my soul screamed coordinates into the warp. I reached for the left restraint and stopped. My hand hovered over the leather strap, fingers trembling slightly, and I felt a surge of something not quite panic, not quite terror, but a deep animal instinct that screamed at me to run, to flee, to do anything except what I was about to do. I pulled my hand back and stood abruptly, my chest tight, my breath coming faster. Not yet, not yet. I needed to be sure. I needed to exhaust every other possibility before I condemned myself to this fate. I returned to the control console with renewed urgency, my fingers flying across the brass controls, cycling through every menu and sub-menu I could access. There had to be something I had missed, some hidden protocol, some emergency override. I pulled up the system diagnostics again, reading through lines of technical data about power levels and resonance frequencies and warp channel stability. Everything was nominal. The beacon was fully functional. It only needed one thing: a human interface. Me. I tried to think like a tech priest, tried to imagine what alternatives they might have considered when designing this system. Could I use a servitor? I read through the technical specifications again, searching for any mention of servitor compatibility. The answer was clear and unambiguous. Servitors lacked the necessary psychic resonance. Their lobotomized brains could not project consciousness through the warp. The beacon required a living, intact human mind, capable of self-awareness and sustained concentration. A servitor would simply sit in the throne and do nothing, its mechanized brain unable to generate the signal. Could I use a timer? Could I set the beacon to activate remotely, somehow delay the process long enough for me to escape? I searched through the activation protocols, looking for delayed start options or remote trigger mechanisms. There were none. The beacon had to be manually activated from the throne itself, and once activated, it had to be continuously sustained, or the signal would collapse within hours. The warp storm's interference was too strong, too chaotic. Without a living consciousness anchoring the beacon's projection, the signal would be drowned out by the storm's psychic noise, useless to the navigators trying to find it. Could I simply activate the beacon and then leave, hoping it would sustain itself long enough for the fleet to pass? I calculated the timing in my head: 48 hours until the fleet arrived, probably another 12 hours for them to navigate through the storm's edge and reach clear space. 60 hours total. The manuals said an unsustained beacon would collapse in 6 to 8 hours. The math was unforgiving. I would need to stay in the throne for at least 60 hours, probably longer, to ensure the signal remained stable. And the life support systems were designed to keep the subject alive far longer than that: weeks, months. The beacon would not let me go after 60 hours. Once I sat down, I would remain there until my body failed and I died. Could I sabotage the beacon? Force the Imperium to find another solution? I considered it seriously for the first time, looking at the massive apparatus of brass and crystal, imagining what would happen if I took my laser rifle and started shooting. The beacon was clearly hardened against damage. Its construction was too robust, too carefully engineered to be vulnerable to small arms fire. And even if I succeeded in destroying it, what then? The fleet would die. 80,000 souls, condemned by my cowardice. I would become a traitor, a heretic, a man who had placed his own life above the Imperium's survival. The Commissar would hunt me down, if I even managed to escape the island, and my death would be neither quick nor honorable. I stood before the console, hands braced against its surface, breathing hard, and forced myself to accept the truth. There was no alternative. The system had been designed with brutal efficiency, with no loopholes and no mercy. Because mercy was a luxury the Imperium could not afford, the beacon required a sacrifice, and I was the sacrifice. and that was the end of the equation. No amount of clever thinking or desperate searching would change the fundamental reality. Someone had to sit in that throne, and I was the only one here. I thought about running anyway. I thought about the staircase, about descending back through the lighthouse, about reaching the dock and diving into the black ocean and letting the cold water take me. I would die on my own terms, at least. I would not have to endure the slow horror of burning in that throne, of feeling my consciousness stretched and torn across the warp while my body withered to nothing. It would be quick, relatively painless, a cleaner end than I deserved. But I could not make myself move toward the door. I stood frozen, staring at the console, and I realized that I had already made the choice. I had made it when I asked how soon I could leave. I had made it when I climbed into that submersible. I had made it 11 years ago when I swore my oath to the Emperor and promised to serve until death. I had been walking toward this throne my entire life. Every order followed, and every battle survived simply a step on the path that led here. There was no escape because I had never wanted to escape. I had wanted to serve. I had wanted to matter, and now I had been given the opportunity to save 80,000 lives, and all it would cost was everything I was. I walked back to the throne. My legs were steady, my hands were steady. I sat down and placed my hands on the armrests, feeling the cold metal beneath my palms, feeling the beacon's hum resonating through my bones. I looked at Guardsman Val in the throne beside me, at his glowing eyes and his skeletal hands, and I thought I saw something there, not pity, not welcome, but a kind of recognition. He had sat where I was sitting. He had felt what I was feeling, and he had chosen to continue, to secure the restraints and activate the crown and become the light. If he could do it, so could I. I reached for the left restraint and secured it across my chest, pulling the leather tight and fastening the buckle with fingers that did not shake. Then the right restraint. Then the ones across my thighs, and finally the ones around my wrists, locking my hands to the armrests. The leather was tight, restrictive, but not painful. The restraints were designed to prevent movement without causing injury. To keep the subject stable during the long weeks and months of transmission, I pulled against them experimentally and found no give. I was locked in place, unable to escape even if I changed my mind, unable to do anything except what I was about to do. I looked up at the neural crown. It hung directly above my head, a circlet of silver wire and dark metal, studded with crystalline nodes that pulsed with faint green light. The mechanism was simple, a manual release that would lower the crown onto my head and engage the interface connections automatically. Once activated, the crown would pierce my temples with microscopic probes, interfacing directly with my brain's psychic centers, bypassing normal sensory processing to tap into the raw consciousness beneath. The sensation would be intense, the manuals had said, pain at first, then expansion, then dissolution. My sense of self would stretch and thin until I became the signal itself. No longer a man but a beacon, no longer conscious but pure transmission. I hesitated. The crown waited above me, patient and inevitable. This was my last moment of choice, my last moment of being fully human. Once I pulled that crown down, I would begin the process of becoming something else, something less and something more, something that served the Imperium in ways I could barely comprehend. I thought about my life, about the battles I had fought and the men I had served beside and the brief moments of peace I had known between deployments. I thought about my name, about the sound of it spoken aloud, about the fact that no one would ever speak it again after today. I would die here, nameless and forgotten, my service recorded in some Mechanicus archive, and then buried beneath centuries of other sacrifices. And I thought about the fleet, about 80,000 souls who were trusting that the light would guide them home, about navigators straining to find a signal in the chaos, about soldiers packed into troop ships, saying prayers to the Emperor, and hoping they would survive to see another battlefield. They did not know me. They would never know me, but I would save them anyway, because that was what it meant to be a soldier in the Astra Militarum, not glory or recognition or reward, just the quiet understanding that someone had to hold the line. And it might as well be you. I reached up and pulled the crown down onto my head. The world exploded into fire and light and screaming. Pain first, white and absolute and all-consuming, searing through my temples like hot knives, spreading through my skull and down my spine like liquid metal poured into my nervous system. I tried to scream but had no breath. Tried to move but the restraints held me rigid. tried to think but thought itself was fragmenting, shattering into a million pieces that scattered across infinite distance. My mind was tearing open, unfolding like a flower made of razors, expanding outward in directions that had no name, no meaning, no reference in the physical world. I felt the warp, not as concept or metaphor but as direct experience, immediate and overwhelming, black and churning and alive, full of screaming faces and impossible geometries that violated every law of physics and sanity, colors that did not exist, sounds that were also textures, distances that meant nothing because distance itself had broken down. The warp storm raged around me, a maelstrom of unreality that twisted space and time into knots, and I was inside it, my consciousness thrust naked into the nightmare, unprotected and fragile and terribly, terribly small. I felt myself stretching, thinning, becoming a thread of light in the infinite dark. My body was distant now, irrelevant, a shell left behind while the essential core of my being was pulled forward, outward, through reality into the spaces between. The beacon roared to life around me, its machinery channeling my consciousness into a focused beam that punched through the warp like a lance. I was the beacon now. My soul was the signal. I could feel it radiating outward, a scream of pure identity, a declaration that I exist. I am here. Follow me home. And then I felt them. The other 43. Their minds surrounded me, a choir of silent voices, pressing against my awareness like ghosts or memories or both. They were still here, still transmitting, still serving even though their bodies had long since begun to fail. Val was there, and the woman beside him whose name I had never learned, and dozens of others whose identities had dissolved into pure signal. They were not dead. They were transformed. They had become light, and light does not die, it only fades, slowly, over years or decades or centuries. I tried to speak, tried to ask them how they endured this, how they maintained any sense of self while stretched across such impossible distances. But I had no mouth, I had no voice, I had no body. I was pure consciousness, pure signal, pure purpose. The pain faded, not because it stopped, but because I stopped being the kind of thing that could feel pain. I was dissolving, my identity fragmenting and scattering, and for a moment I felt terror so profound it eclipsed everything else, a primal fear of annihilation that went deeper than any battlefield horror. But the other 43 were there, holding me, anchoring me, teaching me without words how to maintain coherence in the chaos. This was what they did. This was their eternal duty, not to transmit blindly but to guide, to maintain awareness and purpose even as their bodies failed and their minds stretched to breaking. They had been doing this for years, for decades, and they would continue doing it for as long as the beacon required, because that was what it meant to serve. Time stopped meaning anything. I could not tell if seconds or hours or days were passing. I existed in a state of eternal now, transmitting, sustaining, being the light. The warp raged around me but could not touch me because I was anchored to the beacon, to the throne, to the 43 minds that sang their silent song beside me. I felt the fleet approaching, distant, struggling, blind in the storm. I pushed my soul toward them, a blazing thread across the nightmare, cutting through the warp's chaos with the pure force of identity. And they found me. I felt their instruments lock onto my signal, felt their relief and gratitude and desperate hope flooding back through the connection. The navigators could see me now, a star in the darkness, a fixed point in the storm's chaos. They adjusted course, turning toward me, following the thread of light I had become. I was saving them. I was guiding them home, and the knowledge filled me with something that might have been pride or might have been simple satisfaction, the feeling of purpose fulfilled, of duty executed perfectly. The pain returned in waves, crashing over me as my body struggled to adapt to the throne's demands. I could feel my physical form now, distant and abstract, heart still beating, lungs still pulling air, but wrong somehow, strained, pushed beyond normal limits. The life support systems were feeding me nutrients and managing my waste and keeping me alive, but barely, and I understood with terrible clarity that this was sustainable only in the most technical sense. My body would last weeks, maybe months, before it failed completely, and even then, the manuals had suggested, the transmission might continue. My consciousness trapped in the warp long after my flesh had turned to dust, but that did not matter. The fleet was following me. They were getting closer, hour by hour, their presence growing stronger in my awareness. I could feel individual ships now, could sense the mass and momentum of capital vessels, could almost hear the prayers of the soldiers and crew aboard them. They were real, they were alive, and they would remain alive because I was burning for them, because I had chosen to sit in this throne and become the light. I wanted to weep, but had no tears. I wanted to scream, but had no voice. I was the beacon, and the beacon does not weep or scream, it only shines. So I shone, pouring everything I was into the signal, sustaining it with will and faith, and the simple stubborn refusal to let it falter. The other 43 sang beside me, their voices joining mine in a harmony that had no sound but was more real than any music. We were the Emperor's light. We were the thread that bound the Imperium together. We were the ones who stayed so others could leave, who burned so others could see, who died so others could live. The hours blurred together, became meaningless. I tracked the fleet's progress not by time but by proximity, by the growing strength of their presence in my awareness. They were through the worst of the storm now, following my light through the final layers of chaos, approaching the calmer space beyond where they could navigate without guidance. Soon they would be safe. Soon I could let go, except I could not let go. The beacon required sustained transmission, and sustained meant sustained continuous, unbroken, until long after the fleet had passed. The manuals had been clear about this. If the signal collapsed too early, ships at the rear of the formation might lose the thread and be pulled back into the storm. I had to hold. I had to keep transmitting for hours more, maybe days, until every vessel had cleared the danger zone. So I held, I burned, I transmitted, and the fleet sailed past, safe and guided and alive, following the light I had become, and I remained, eternal and immobile and ablaze, no longer fully human but not yet fully gone, suspended in the space between life and death, while the warp raged and the beacon hummed and the 43 sang their silent song beside me. The fleet passed overhead, not literally overhead, because direction had become meaningless in the state I now inhabited, but through the space my consciousness occupied, vessels moving along the psychic thread I had become. I felt them like pressure, like weight, like the passage of something vast and ponderous through water. 12 capital ships, hundreds of support craft, 80,000 souls wrapped in metal and faith, and the Emperor's dubious protection. They followed my light through the final layers of the storm. Their navigators locked onto my signal with desperate intensity, and I guided them with everything I had left, pouring the remnants of my identity into the beacon's transmission. I could sense individual ships now with startling clarity, the undaunted Verdict, the carrier I had departed from, its massive bulk grinding forward through the warp like a floating cathedral. Troop transports packed with soldiers like I had been, standing in embarkation bays and checking their equipment and praying to survive whatever battlefield awaited them. Supply haulers and munitions, ships and mobile repair facilities. The unglamorous logistics that kept the Imperium's war machine functioning. Each vessel was a world unto itself. Thousands of souls living and working and dying in the void, and I held the thread that kept them from being lost forever in the storm's chaos. The pain had become constant now, a background roar that I existed within rather than experienced directly. My body was failing. I could sense that even through the distance and abstraction, my heart was beating too fast, stressed by the throne's demands and the life support system's chemical interventions. My lungs pulled air in shallow gasps, barely oxygenating blood that was thick with metabolic waste the throne's filters could not fully process. My muscles had atrophied, unused, fed by nutrient paste that kept me alive but could not prevent the slow wasting that came from absolute immobility. How long had I been sitting here? Hours? Days? I could not tell. Time had become elastic, unreliable, measured only by the fleet's progress and the steady diminishment of my physical resources. The other 43 surrounded me in the choir, their presences familiar now, almost comforting. They did not speak. Speech was impossible in this state, but they communicated in ways that transcended language, sharing experience and understanding, and the grim solidarity of shared suffering. I learned their stories through osmosis, through the bleed of consciousness that occurred when minds were pressed this close together. Val had been the first, sitting in his throne 23 years ago when the lighthouse was first activated, his sacrifice opening the way for all who followed. The woman beside him had come 6 years later, a Katachan jungle fighter who had volunteered after her entire squad was wiped out and she decided she had nothing left to lose. Others had similar tales, losses too great to bear, guilt that demanded atonement, or simply the cold calculation that their lives were worth less than the thousands they could save. Some had been here so long they had forgotten their names, their identities dissolved into pure signal, nothing remaining but the function they served. Others clung to fragments of memory, repeating prayers or remembering faces or holding tight to single moments of joy or peace. They refused to let the warp consume. I understood now that this was the real battle, not the physical endurance of sitting in the throne, but the mental endurance of maintaining coherence while everything you were slowly burned away. The beacon did not simply transmit your consciousness, it consumed it, feeding on your identity to fuel the signal. And only constant vigilance could prevent total dissolution. I clung to my own memories like lifelines, cycling through them deliberately to maintain awareness of who I had been. Vorash IV, the mud and blood and screaming, gest secundus. The feel of the trigger beneath my finger and the satisfaction of perfect shots. The weight of my las rifle, the smell of recaf in the mess hall, the sound of the commissar's voice reading orders. Simple things, mundane things. But they were mine and they proved I had existed as something other than signal. I repeated my name silently, over and over. A mantra against dissolution, except I could not quite remember it anymore. The sounds were there, familiar, but the meaning had become slippery, uncertain. Was it important? It must have been important once. People had called me by that name. But who? When? The details were fading, burned away by the beacon's hunger. I felt panic rising, cold and visceral, the terror of watching yourself disappear piece by piece. I tried to hold tighter to the memories, tried to force them into sharp focus, but the effort was exhausting, and the memories kept slipping away like water through cupped hands. How long could I maintain this? How long before I joined the others who had forgotten everything, who existed now as pure function with no awareness of having ever been human? The manuals had said weeks, months, but those measurements assumed you were trying to resist. What if I simply let go? What if I stopped fighting and allowed the dissolution to happen? Would it be easier? Would it be kinder? The choir pressed closer, offering something that might have been reassurance or might have been warning. They had all faced this moment, this choice between clinging and release. Some had chosen to fight, to preserve what they could of themselves for as long as possible. Others had chosen surrender, allowing the beacon to consume them completely, becoming perfect transmitters with no self-awareness to suffer the process. Neither choice was wrong. Neither choice changed the outcome. We would all be consumed eventually. The only variable was how much of ourselves we spent trying to prevent it. I made my choice without fully understanding why. I let go, not all at once, that would have been too much, too frightening, but piece by piece, allowing memories to fade when they wanted to fade, allowing thoughts to drift into static when they lost coherence. My name dissolved first, the sounds becoming meaningless syllables, and then nothing at all. My face followed, the mental image of my own features blurring and vanishing. My past, my service record, my battles and fears and small moments of peace, all of it drifted away like smoke, and I found myself watching it go with something close to relief. The pain diminished as I released identity. Without a self to experience suffering, the body's distress became abstract, data rather than sensation. My consciousness simplified, streamlined, optimizing itself for the single function it now served. I was the light. I was the beacon. I was the thread that guided the lost home. That was enough. That had always been enough. The complexity of being human, the doubts and fears and desires and regrets, all of it was unnecessary weight, and I was grateful to be rid of it. The fleet reached safe passage. I felt the moment when the last ship cleared the storm's edge, when the navigators finally released their death grip on my signal and breathed prayers of thanks to the Emperor and the Astronomicon. They were safe. All 80,000 souls, guided through the nightmare by a light they would never know was human, would never know had been a man named. The name was gone. It did not matter. What mattered was that they were safe, that my burning had served its purpose, that the Imperium would continue grinding forward because 80,000 more souls had survived to serve it. I had done my duty. I had held the line. And now I could rest. Except I could not rest. The beacon would not release me. The fleet had passed, but the storm continued, and other ships might come, might need guidance, might follow the thread I had become. The throne's life support systems continued their work, feeding my body, filtering my blood, keeping me alive in the technical sense, even as everything that made me burned away. I would remain here, transmitting, for weeks or months or years, until my body finally failed, and even then my consciousness might linger, trapped in the warp, screaming coordinates into the void forever. Time became truly meaningless. I existed in an eternal present, neither remembering the past nor anticipating the future. I was pure function, pure transmission, pure light. The other 43 surrounded me, and I understood now that we were not really 44 separate beings anymore. We had merged, our consciousnesses blending in the beacon's core, becoming a single entity with 44 voices, a choir that sang in perfect harmony because we had forgotten how to be anything except the song. Ships came. I guided them. They passed. More came. I guided them. Time spiraled and collapsed and meant nothing. My body withered, flesh drawing tight over bone, systems failing one by one while the throne compensated, rerouted, sustained the bare minimum necessary to keep the signal alive. I did not feel it happen. I did not feel anything except the beacon's hum and the warp's chaos and the eternal transmission that had become my only purpose. Somewhere in the dissolution, I found peace. Not happiness. Happiness required a self capable of experiencing emotion, but peace. The deep quiet that comes from absolute surrender, from the release of every burden and every choice. I had worried so much when I was human, had carried so much doubt and fear and desperate need for meaning. Now I carried nothing. I was nothing. Only the light remained, and the light did not doubt or fear or need. It only shone. I remembered something then, a fragment that surfaced briefly before dissolving again. A moment in the briefing room, standing at attention, the commissar's eyes meeting mine for a single cold second. He had known what I was walking toward. He had sent me anyway, not because he was cruel, but because someone had to go, and I had asked no questions. I had volunteered by my obedience, by my willingness to serve without understanding what service would cost. And now I understood, finally, that this was the Imperium's true nature, not glory or righteousness or faith, but an endless machine that consumed lives and souls and identities and ground them into fuel for its own continuation. I was fuel. We were all fuel, and the machine would never stop, would never rest, would never show mercy, because mercy was a luxury it could not afford. I felt no anger at this realization, no bitterness or betrayal. Those emotions required a self, and I no longer possessed one. I simply observed the truth, acknowledged it, and returned to transmitting because that was my function, and function was all I had left. The beacon hummed, the warp raged, the choir sang, and I shone, eternal and unchanging, a star in the darkness, asking nothing, receiving nothing, simply being what I had been made to be. My body failed finally, completely. Systems cascading into shutdown one after another, until only the brain remained, kept alive by the throne's most essential functions. And then even that began to dim, neurons dying, consciousness fragmenting into smaller and smaller pieces. I felt myself dissolving, not metaphorically but literally. Awareness breaking apart like ice in warm water, each piece drifting away until there was nothing left to hold them together. The last thing I remembered, the final fragment of something that might once have been human, was the storm. Not the warp storm or the weather outside the lighthouse, but an inner storm, the chaos of a mind coming apart. And in that chaos I heard voices, or thought I heard voices, or remembered hearing voices from a time before I had sat in the throne. They were saying something, but I could not make out the words. They were calling something, but I could not remember what. And then even that faded, and there was only light, pure and eternal and empty, shining in the darkness of a galaxy that would never know my name because I no longer had one, shining for ships that would never thank me because I was no longer present to receive thanks, shining because that was all that remained when everything else had burned away. The Emperor protects, someone had told me once. I did not remember who, I did not remember when, but I understood now what those words really meant. Not that the Emperor would save me, but that through my sacrifice, I would protect others. I had become his light. I had become his protection, and I would shine until there was nothing left to shine with, and then I would shine with what remained after nothing, because the Imperium required it, and requirement was the only god I had ever really served. The beacon hummed its eternal note. The throne held my withered body in its cold embrace. The storm raged beyond the crystalline dome, and I transmitted into the void. No longer man or soldier or even memory. Only signal. Only light. Only the thin thread that bound the Imperium together. Shining for lost souls I would never meet, burning so others might find their way home, holding the line because someone had to hold it, and I had asked how soon I could leave, and the answer, always, had been never. I asked no questions then, and I ask none now.